Welcome to It Pays to Fear God. This is me, your fellow Bible student, Ewaenruwa Nomaren, and I want to discuss the topic, the prodigal son. Many Christians have heard about this story because it is a beautiful story that Jesus Christ told us, a parable in fact, in Luke chapter 15 from verses 11 to 32. The reason why Jesus Christ told us this parable is for us to understand the story of humanity, as in humanity's beginning, humanity's fall, and humanity's return. But before I really get into anything considering the parable, I just want to throw a question at you that you can answer in the comment section below, which is not related to this subject, but is very significant. And that question is, what is the significance of Zion in our time? After you've answered that question in the comment section below, continue watching this video. And after that, you can check out a video that we've made that has talked a lot about Zion, which is God will arise and have mercy upon Zion. So you can check that out. The link is in the description below. So, in Luke chapter 15 from verses 11 to 32, Jesus Christ told the story of a man who had two sons. One of the sons was responsible. He did what a son was expected to do. But the other son was different. He wanted to take his inheritance early. Usually you would take it after your father dies. You would collect the property and so on. But this son wanted to take it early so that he could live a different life. A life with more in it. And the father yielded. He didn't say that he wasn't going to do it. He did it for him. And then the prodigal son took his money that he had and he went on into a far country where he squandered it with what the Bible called riotous living. Riotous means wild, uncontrolled, wanton, all of this world kind of living. So that was the life that he lived. And not very long after, well, all his money was finished. And there arose a great famine in the land, and that worsened his condition. Now he could barely even eat. His worries were now, how am I going to have my 3 square meals? Then he managed to sort of get under or get protection from someone who would send him to feed pigs or swines. And his condition got so bad that the food that he was feeding to those pigs, which ideally would look disgusting to someone who can have 3 square meals in a day, now that food was looking good to him because he had no way of eating anything else and nobody wanted to help him in any way. And eventually it dawned on him that, why am I living this kind of life? Why is it that all the people I left behind in my father's house, my brother, the servants, they don't need to worry about food. They at least have food to eat and to spare. But me, I'm pretty much dying of hunger. And then he realized how foolish he really was, how senseless his actions were. And then he convinced himself that I'm going to go back to my father and I know I'm going to tell him that I am not even worthy to be called your son because I've messed up to a degree I cannot even describe. All I want to do is just come back to your household and be as one of your hired servants. So then, with that in mind, he went back to his father. But way before he even reached the household, he was already a long distance away, but then his father noticed him, noticed that someone was coming. And then he became very excited. He ran towards him, knowing that it was his son. And then he gave him the most warm welcome that you could ever imagine. He not only kissed him and, greeted him with all sense of pleasure and enjoyment, like, yes, I'm so excited. But he made sure that the best robe was brought and it clothed him. And there was a fatted calf that was killed for him. And there was a big celebration. There was much merry. Very few people would have the honor of being celebrated like that. And his brother, the prodigal son's brother, knew this, which is why it was like, why should such a fool be given such a celebration? I am the one who's been doing all the work. I've been the consistent, reliable, responsible, decent son, and I never get celebrated like this. So, and his father noticed that he wasn't joining in the celebration, and then after this son had told him that, he was like, look, everything that I have is already yours. You've been the son that I've always wanted you to be. But you have to understand the fact that something very special has happened. I thought that my son was gone, but now he has returned. I thought he was dead, but now he is alive again. This deserves celebration, and then that is where the story ended. It is a very beautiful story indeed, but what is more beautiful is its meaning, and that is also why the parable was preserved in the first place. We need those kinds of stories in order to understand what's happening in our time and other times. If we read Romans chapter 15 verse 4 and 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 11. So let's dive more into what the story means, as in like, why did certain events happen, and how does that relate to the purpose that the parable was given or told, and that is to tell the story of humanity. So let's backtrack and go to the beginning again. Essentially, the man had two sons, and the prodigal son, didn't really feel happy with the way life was. He wasn't content with potentially the farm life that the man was living, or whatever kind of life. He wanted to go to where things were more vibrant, where everything was happening, a far land from where he currently was. He just wasn't content with the way his father did his things. And he needed money in order to be able to achieve his dreams, to explore the world, and that was why he asked for his inheritance. So essentially, this relates to what humanity did in Genesis chapter 3 from verses 1 to 6. We wanted to go our own way. And obviously Satan, the devil, who already excluded himself from God's family, helped in that process. Essentially, when God created human beings, he created them so that they could live their lives generally. He gave them that opportunity to express their opinions, decide if they wanted to obey him or if they wanted to go their own way, which humans can't really do that well, as I will discuss slightly later. But he gave us that option by giving us free will. It's not that he forced us. We have that opportunity. We have that chance. And the Bible calls that grace. And we squandered it by following after Satan the devil and disobeying him. That's why they ate the apple in Genesis chapter 3 from verses 1 to 6 once again. They didn't really feel content with the way God was generally doing his things, and this was propelled by what Satan the devil told Eve. Satan the devil told her that God doesn't want you to eat the apple because he knows that you guys are going to be special. You're going to be gods. You're going to be very mighty people. You'll know everything that he knows and all of that. And that inspired them to go their own way because, I mean, if we know everything that we need to know and if we are capable of going our own way, I mean, it's freedom. Why don't we just go and take the opportunity? And that was what caused us to plunge into sin. We became like lost sheep. If we read 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 25 and Isaiah chapter 53 verse 6. King Solomon described it as going after and creating our own inventions. If we read Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 29. And when we went our own way, Satan the devil took over the whole world because now he controls human beings. That's why he was called the God of this world in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verses 3 and 4. And he helped us to set up various things that drove us away from God. Those things included empires with kings and lords that called themselves semi-divine. God never wanted that kind of system to prevail over the world, but Satan the devil wanted to use those to keep the world under his sway. If we read 1 John chapter 5 verse 19. Then he made sure that there was a big economy that everyone would seek after. Obviously, loving money is bad, if we read 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10. But he wanted to organize the world so that everyone would be seeking after money and filthy lucre and so on. There's an elite class, and then there's the poor class that everyone trashes, nobody cares about it, and there's the normal class that most people want to be in. In modern terms, it might be the middle class and the other things. But he set up the world so that we could go astray, so that generally we would not be able to return to God. That was just like the prodigal son who decided to go his own way, go into a far country where he wouldn't remember his father anymore, where he'd see different ways. We invested in those kinds of different ways, and that leads me to my next point. Generally, because we went in our own ways, we, in a sense, squandered our grace that we got from God. God gave us the ability to choose him and live righteous, peaceful lives. He created us to worship him, of course, if we read Isaiah chapter 43, verse 21. And when we worship him, there is that sense of peace and assurance and righteousness that creates happiness in our lives. But we squandered that by wanting to go our own way. And like I said, human beings are not capable of going their own way against what God wants us to do. If we read Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 23, Jeremiah the prophet told us, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. See also Proverbs chapter 20, verse 24. And if you look at Genesis chapter 6 from verses 1 to 5, you can see the description of humanity at that time. Things were corrupt. People had evil intent against their neighbors. People didn't have that godliness, that righteousness, that good neighborliness that makes the world good, makes it a better place. No, everyone was thinking about their own secret, personal gains. And that is why he even regretted putting those humans who would do all those kinds of iniquities in the first place. And to understand this better, let's downsize and go to a specific group of people, which were the Israelites. They also experienced that kind of squandering in the light of God gave them customs and traditions and laws that would make them better than the nations around them. These laws were called ornaments and jewels and other things. In Ezekiel chapter 16 from verses 8 to 18. Those were what made them special and different from the stupid nations that were around them. However, they squandered that by bringing those false religions and gods into their lives. The Asherah pole became established and well known among all Israelites. Many of them worshipped it, bowed down to it, made sacrifices and incenses to it, and so on and so forth. People became corrupt. Kings didn't do what God wanted them to do anymore. People didn't think spiritually. It was all about money and the bribery and other things like that. Life didn't go the way God wanted it to. And that was why they ended up becoming like everyone else. At that point, Israel was not different from the Ammonites and the Midianites and those other peoples. That was why God considered them like Sodom and Gomorrah in Isaiah chapter 1 verse 10. Obviously, if you look at Genesis chapter 19, Sodom and Gomorrah were places infested with iniquities. And because Israel eventually became like that, they were referred to as sinful places such as those. And this is also why they were even described as somebody who is filled with boils and putrefying sores in Isaiah chapter 1 and verses 4 and 6. They're just different ways of looking at the facts that when we veer off from God's principles, when we squander his grace, life doesn't end well. And it's all because we want to be independent, just like how the Israelites, once again, wanted to be independent. They wanted to create their own kingdoms and nations instead of relying on God's protection. And for Samuel chapter 8, from verses 1 to 8 and verses 19 and 20. But it's important we understand God is not someone who wants to force us to remain in his wings or shadow. If he wants to veer off, he allows us to do that because he is someone who likes people who voluntarily worship him. So when the Israelites, for example, wanted to set up their own nation with a king and their own standing army, just like the Gentile nations, if we once again read for Samuel chapter 8 and verses 19 and 20, he hated the idea, if we read Hosea chapter 13 from verses 9 to 11. But he allowed them to do that. He allowed them to go their own way because he doesn't police our lives in that kind of light. Now, let's move on to the facts that in the prodigal son story, he eventually realized that the life that he was living was horrible. You know, having to eat what pigs eat, not having 3 square meals a day, losing all your money, it's a horrible life to live. And he realized that he had been foolish, he had been senseless. And what does this mean for humans in our time? Essentially, many humans in this world realize the fact that running after money, creating kingdoms and so on, it doesn't create happiness. It only makes life worse because there's oppression and there's social injustice and there's racism and there's all kinds of problems that God never had in mind when creating the world. Those come as a result of us trying to make our lives work without God's intervention. And certain humans decide that those ways don't really work anymore, and then they go humble themselves before God. And that is what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to realize that the ways of the world, the ways of Satan and the devil, are not really peaceful. They aren't really going to bring happiness in the end, and we should humble ourselves before God so that God can teach us how to live our lives. David said in Psalms chapter 25 verse 9, "The meek will he guide in judgment, and the meek will he teach his ways." See also Psalms chapter 138 verse 6, where it was described in another light. God likes people who humble themselves before him. He will teach them how to live their lives. If you also look at Job chapter 36 from verses 9 to 12, it says it in another light. And there Job told us, "He sheweth them their work, and their transgressions that they have exceeded. He openeth also their ear to discipline, and commandeth that they return from iniquity. If they obey and serve him, they shall spend their days in prosperity, and their years in pleasures. But if they obey not, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge." That is what happens to people who want to go their own way and who cannot humble themselves once they realize that that way is bad. Those who conceal their sins will never move on, but those who confess them, who go back to God and tell them that I have failed and I know you can help bring me out of this condition, those are the ones who will improve. If we read Proverbs chapter 28 verse 13. It's very important we understand this. And look at Israel. Israel did the same thing. After they realized that their condition was horrible, they eventually came back to their senses and were like, maybe we are really the ones who have failed and God has the way into peace. That was why people like Daniel and Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations were like, we have sinned and we have come to realize that our ways, the ways of the worlds that we decided to adapt, were never profitable in the beginning. And we have come to know that we should return to you because it is with you that life goes well. It's important that we humble ourselves before God so that we can receive that guidance. Now, the last third of the parable of the prodigal son was a celebration where the father celebrated the fact that his son had returned. And the Bible makes us to know that God will also have mercy on us like that. He will also bring us back into his fold very happily and celebrate. If you read Job chapter 33 and verses 27 and 28, it makes us to know that he is humble enough to look upon man and deliver them from the ditch that they dig themselves into. And that place says, "He looketh upon men, and if any say, I have sinned, and perverted that which was right, and it profiteth me not, he will deliver his soul from going into the pit, and his life shall see the light." Also, if we read Isaiah chapter 52 and verses 1 and 2, it says it in a more prophetic and inspiring way. That place reads, "Awake, awake, put on thy strength, O Zion, put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For henceforth there shall no more come into thee the uncircumcised and the unclean. Shake thyself from the dust. Arise, and sit down, O Jerusalem. Loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion." It's another way of making us to know that God can uplift us from such ways if we humble ourselves before him. And Jesus Christ made us to know that when that happens, when we are uplifted, that creates joy, way more than just normal people living righteous lives. Just as how when the prodigal son came back, this father received him with all kinds of celebration, but when the responsible son was just doing his job, there was no celebration or fatted calf killed for him and so on. And Jesus Christ told us in that Luke chapter 15 verse 7, "I say unto you that likewise joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons which needeth no repentance." He wants to rework this world so that we do not rely on oppression and all of that to stay afloat. No, he knows that the way to peace is with righteousness and humility to his principles. No matter what kind of condition that we're in, his loving kindness can help in bringing us back because his loving kindness lasts forever. He said in Isaiah chapter 54 verse 10, "For the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee, nor shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord that hath mercy on thee." I hope we now understand what the parable of the prodigal son really means. To conclude, let's just look at Isaiah chapter 35 verse 10, because it really helps to summarize everything that has been said. Now, if you read it from verse 1, it gives a more elaborate description of how the world will be, how it will be rescued. But verse 10 is almost like a summary of the whole chapter. And verse 10 says, "And the ransomed of the Lord shall return, and come to Zion with songs, and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away." And that is where I'm going to stop on discussing that subject, the prodigal son. I hope that you have enjoyed this video and have now come to see the story of the prodigal son in a more refined and biblical light. I just want to look at what St. Paul said in Romans chapter 15 verse 4, because it makes us to understand the purpose of this particular parable and every other story and example and instance that the Bible has been preserved to have. And St. Paul told us there, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope." Therefore, any parable that we see, we should use it to understand what God is doing in our time, because as St. Paul said, that is the reason why it was written down in the first place. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and don't forget to check out the things that we have in the description below, because those are extra resources that you can check out to know more about who God is. Also, don't forget to check out the channels that are in front of you right now, because those are places where we have discussed more specific and other topics related to the Bible. Have a great day, and God bless you.